What if everything you believed about your enemy was a lie? Imagine standing on foreign soil, thousands of miles from home, expecting cruelty and punishment, only to find something so unexpected, it shakes the very core of who you are. This isn't just a story about war. It's about a moment in history when the lines between friend and foe blurred and the truth was stranger than any propaganda. June 1940. The world was on fire. Across Europe, armies clashed, cities burned, and millions were swept up in a conflict that seemed to have no end. For one German soldier named Fron Vapor, the war had already taken everything familiar. Captured in the chaos of battle, he was shipped across the Atlantic, far from the ruins of Europe, to a place he'd only heard about in rumors, Canada. But what happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about enemies, about freedom, and about the real meaning of strength. Picture this. Franz steps off a train in the middle of nowhere. He expects barbed wire, guard towers, and the cold eyes of men ready to shoot at the slightest provocation. Instead, he finds open fields stretching to the horizon, green grass waving in the wind, and a handful of wooden buildings that look more like summer cabins than prison barracks. There are no fences, no walls, no machine guns pointed at his back. Just a Canadian guard in a crisp uniform, looking almost bored, who tells him, "You can go for a walk if you want. Just be back by dinner." For a moment, Fron is frozen. Is this some kind of trick? Is he being set up? Every story he's ever heard, every warning from his officers, every headline in the German newspapers, has told him that capture means suffering, that the enemy is cruel, that escape is impossible, that hope is for fools. But here, in the middle of the Canadian prairie, nothing makes sense. The guard's words echo in his mind, chilling him more than any threat ever could. This is the moment when Fran's world begins to unravel. He's not just a prisoner of war. He's a man caught between two realities. On one side, the iron certainty of everything he's been taught. On the other, the quiet, unsettling kindness of strangers who should hate him. What happens when the enemy treats you better than your own country? What if the real prison isn't made of walls and wire, but of lies you've been told your whole life? As Franz stands at the edge of the camp, staring out at the endless fields, he has no idea that his greatest battle is just beginning. Not a battle of guns and bombs, but a battle for the truth. And the first shot has just been fired. Fran's first days in Canada felt like stepping into a dream, or maybe a nightmare he couldn't quite understand. The journey itself was a blur of confusion and disbelief. After being captured on the battered fields of France, he and hundreds of other German soldiers were herded onto a ship bound for a place most of them couldn't even find on a map. The Atlantic crossing was endless, gray waves stretching in every direction, the sky as heavy as the uncertainty in their hearts. Some men got seasick, others just stared at the horizon, wondering what fate awaited them on the other side of the world. When the ship finally docked, Fron expected the worst. He braced himself for the cattle cars, the jeering crowds, the humiliation he'd been warned about. But instead, the prisoners were loaded onto real passenger trains, clean, with seats and windows. As the train rolled deeper into the Canadian heartland, Fron pressed his face to the glass, stunned by what he saw. Endless forests, rivers wider than any he'd ever imagined, towns with neat houses and shiny cars parked outside. The land seemed to go on forever, a vastness that made Germany feel small and distant. But the real shock came when the train finally stopped in a small Alberta town. The guards marched the prisoners down a dusty road, and Fran's heart pounded as he searched for the telltale signs of a prison camp: barbed wire, watchtowers, snarling dogs. Instead, he saw rows of wooden buildings, a flagpole with the red maple leaf fluttering in the breeze, and guards who looked more like bored office workers than ruthless captors. There was no fence, no wall. Just open prairie stretching out in every direction, as if the land itself was daring anyone to try and escape. A Canadian officer addressed the prisoners in perfect German, explaining the rules. They would be treated fairly, he said, according to international law. They would work if asked, but they would not be abused. Then came the words that made Fran's blood run cold. There is no fence because there is nowhere to run. If you try to escape, you'll die in the wilderness or freeze in the winter. It's safer to stay. Fron looked around at the other prisoners. Some whispered in disbelief, others just stared, their faces pale with confusion. One older soldier started laughing, a hollow, broken sound that sent chills down Fron's spine. Was this some kind of psychological trick? Was the real punishment still to come? Every instinct told him to be on guard, to expect betrayal at any moment. That first night in the barracks, Fron lay awake, listening to the wind sweep across the prairie. The building was clean and warm, with real beds and thick blankets. There was a stove in the center, shelves for personal items, and windows that let in the soft glow of moonlight. It was better than some of the army barracks he'd slept in back home, but the comfort only made him more uneasy. He kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the cruelty he'd been promised to finally reveal itself. But morning came, and with it, another shock. Instead of cold water and stale bread, the smell of bacon and eggs drifted through the air. Canadian cooks served up plates piled high with food, more than Fron had seen in months. The guards chatted casually, barely paying attention to the prisoners. It was as if the war, the hatred, the propaganda, all of it had been left behind on the other side of the ocean. Fron couldn't make sense of any of it. Was this really how the enemy treated their prisoners? Was this the real Canada, or just another illusion? As he ate his breakfast in silence, surrounded by men who were just as bewildered as he was, Fron realized that everything he thought he knew was up for grabs. And deep down, a new kind of fear began to grow, the fear that maybe, just maybe, he'd been lied to all along. But that was only the beginning. The real surprises were still to come. For Fron, the most unsettling part of his new reality wasn't the open fields or the lack of fences. It was the slow, creeping realization that everything he'd been taught about the enemy, about America, about Canada, about the so-called decadent West, was unraveling before his eyes. Back in Germany, the message had been hammered into him from every direction. The Allies were monsters, their countries were weak, their people were desperate. The radio blared it, the newspapers printed it, and his officers repeated it until it became a kind of gospel. If you were captured, they said, you'd be lucky to survive. You'd be starved, beaten, humiliated. You'd be treated like an animal or worse. But here, in the heart of North America, Fron saw a different world. The train ride across Canada had already shaken his confidence. He'd watched mile after mile of rich farmland, endless forests and towns that looked untouched by war. Power lines stretched across the landscape, roads crisscrossed the countryside, and factories sent plumes of smoke into the sky. Everything looked organized, efficient, and most shocking of all, peaceful. There were no bombed-out buildings, no lines of refugees, no signs of a country on the brink of collapse. Instead, there was abundance. There was order. There was a sense of calm strength that Fron had never seen before. He remembered the stories from the Great War, tales of German prisoners forced to eat rats to survive, of camps where men froze to death in the mud. But here, the reality was almost the opposite. The barracks were clean and warm. The food was plentiful. The guards were polite, even friendly. It was as if the Canadians, and by extension their American allies, were determined to prove every German rumor wrong, not with words but with actions. Each day brought new evidence that the propaganda was crumbling. Fron received letters from home, filled with stories of ration cards, empty shelves, and bread made with sawdust. His mother wrote about air raids and cold nights, about neighbors who had disappeared, about a country that was supposed to be winning, but felt like it was losing everything that mattered. Meanwhile, Fron was gaining weight. His skin looked healthier. His teeth were being fixed by Canadian doctors. He was living better as a prisoner than his family was as free citizens in Germany. The contrast was impossible to ignore. How could the enemy have so much, while his own people had so little? How could a country that was supposed to be weak and decadent provide more for its prisoners than Germany could provide for its own children? The questions gnawed at him, day and night, until doubt became a constant companion. It wasn't just the material comforts that shook Fran's beliefs. It was the attitude of the Canadians themselves. They didn't seem to hate him. They didn't treat him like a monster. In fact, they seemed almost indifferent to the fact that he was supposed to be their enemy. There was no gloating, no cruelty, no need to prove their superiority. Instead, there was a quiet confidence, a sense that they didn't need to shout about their strength. They simply lived it. For the first time, Fron began to wonder if the real strength of a country wasn't measured in tanks or guns, but in how it treated the people it captured. Maybe the greatest power wasn't the ability to destroy, but the ability to show mercy. Maybe the real victory wasn't on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who saw the truth for themselves. As the days passed, Fran's old certainties faded away, replaced by a growing sense of confusion and a dangerous new curiosity. If everything he'd been told about the enemy was a lie, what else had he been wrong about? What other truths were waiting to be discovered, hidden behind the walls of propaganda and fear? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: the world was much bigger and much stranger than he had ever imagined, and the next revelation was just around the corner. Life inside the Canadian camp was nothing like the nightmare Fron had braced himself for. Each day, he woke up expecting the illusion to shatter, for the guards to reveal their true colors, for the comfort to be snatched away. But instead, the routine settled into something almost peaceful, something that felt, in a strange way, like a second chance at life. The barracks were simple but clean, lined with rows of sturdy wooden beds. Each man had two thick blankets, a pillow, and a shelf for his few belongings. Sunlight streamed through glass windows, and a cast-iron stove glowed in the center, keeping the chill of the prairie at bay. At night, Fron would lie awake, listening to the wind sweep across the open fields, the soft murmur of voices, and the distant laughter of guards sharing stories by the fire. There were no screams, no threats, no midnight punishments. The silence was almost unsettling. But it was the food that truly stunned him. Every morning, the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee drifted through the camp. Breakfast was a feast: scrambled eggs, toast with real butter, strips of crispy bacon, and steaming mugs of coffee with sugar. Lunch brought hearty soups, thick sandwiches piled with meat and cheese, and sometimes even slices of pie. Dinner was a spread of roasted chicken or beef, potatoes, vegetables, and warm bread. On Sundays, the portions grew even larger, as if the Canadians wanted to remind their prisoners that abundance was the norm, not the exception. Fron ate slowly at first, suspicious of the generosity, but hunger always won out. Around him, other prisoners devoured their meals in silence, some with tears in their eyes, unable to believe their luck. For many, it was the first time in years they'd felt truly full. The guards watched with mild amusement, chatting among themselves, never rushing the men or barking orders. It was as if the war was a distant memory and the camp was just another small town on the endless Canadian prairie. The shock of this new reality ran deep. Letters from home painted a picture of a Germany in ruins: bombed cities, empty pantries, families scraping by on rations that barely kept them alive. Fran's mother wrote about bread made with sawdust, about neighbors who had vanished, about the cold that seeped into their bones each winter. Meanwhile, Fron was gaining weight, his cheeks filling out, his skin glowing with health. He felt guilty, almost ashamed, as if he were stealing comfort from those who needed it most. But the surprises didn't end with food and shelter. The camp itself was open, with no fences or walls to keep the men inside. During the day, prisoners could walk freely within the boundaries marked by a line of white stones. Some were even allowed to work on nearby farms, helping Canadian families with the harvest. The farmers treated them like hired hands, offering lemonade and sandwiches, sometimes even trusting them with tools, or in one unbelievable case, a shotgun to scare off pests. The money they earned was set aside in accounts they could access after the war, a promise that life would go on, that there was a future waiting for them somewhere beyond the horizon. Inside the camp, the Canadians encouraged the men to build a community. There was a recreation hall filled with books and games, a piano for those who could play, and even a small theater group that put on German plays for both prisoners and guards. Soccer matches became a weekly event, with teams from different barracks competing for bragging rights. The laughter, the cheers, the sense of normalcy, it all felt surreal, as if the war had been paused and the world outside had faded away. Yet beneath the surface, confusion and guilt simmered. How could prison feel so much like freedom? How could the enemy show such kindness when everything Fron had been taught said they would be cruel? Each day, the cracks in his old beliefs grew wider, letting in the light of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But the most unforgettable lesson was still to come, a moment that would change Fron's life forever and reveal just how powerful compassion could be, even in the darkest of times. If there was one thing Fron never expected to find in a prisoner of war camp, it was freedom. Yet day by day, the boundaries of his captivity seemed to dissolve, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, a strange, almost unsettling trust. In Germany, he'd been taught that the enemy was ruthless, that every guard was a potential executioner, and that escape was the only hope for dignity. But here, in the heart of North America, the rules were different. The enemy didn't just tolerate their prisoners, they trusted them. It started with the simple act of walking. After breakfast, Fron was told he could stroll around the camp as he pleased, as long as he didn't cross the line of white stones marking the edge of the grounds. There were no watchtowers, no searchlights, no snarling dogs. The guards lounged nearby, chatting and laughing, barely glancing at the men as they wandered through the open prairie air. Fron's heart pounded the first time he approached the boundary, half expecting a shout or a gunshot. But nothing happened. The prairie stretched out before him, endless and wild, a silent reminder that escape was pointless, not because of walls, but because of the sheer, overwhelming vastness of the land. The trust went even further. Some prisoners were chosen to work on local farms, driven out each morning by Canadian guards who seemed more like chauffeurs than captors. The farmers greeted them with nods and handshakes, offering water and snacks, treating them like any other hired help. One day, a farmer handed a German prisoner a shotgun and asked him to protect the crops from gophers. The man could have run, could have turned the weapon on his captors, but he didn't. Where would he go? The farmer's wife waved from the porch. Their children played in the yard, and the prisoner realized he was being trusted not as an enemy, but as a human being. The money they earned for their labor was set aside in accounts in Switzerland, a promise that their work would mean something after the war. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The Canadians weren't just following the rules. They were going out of their way to show respect, to offer dignity, to treat their prisoners as men, not monsters. Inside the camp, the sense of trust grew stronger. The guards encouraged the prisoners to organize their own activities, to form soccer teams, to put on plays, to build a life within the boundaries of their captivity. There were no forced marches, no arbitrary punishments, no attempts to break their spirits. Instead, there was a quiet expectation that the men would respect the rules because they were being respected in return. For Fron, this was the most disorienting part of all. He had been prepared for cruelty, for hardship, for a daily struggle to survive. He had not been prepared for kindness. He had not been prepared to feel safe. The absence of fear was almost more frightening than fear itself. It forced him to question everything he thought he knew about the world, about his enemies, about himself. The other prisoners felt it too. Some whispered that it was all a trick, that the Canadians were lulling them into complacency before some terrible punishment. Others began to relax, to smile, to laugh again. The camp became a strange kind of community, a place where men who had once marched under the swastika now played soccer with the same men they had been taught to hate. But the most powerful lesson was yet to come. The true test of trust, the moment that would shatter the last of Fron's old beliefs, was waiting just around the corner. And when it arrived, it would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in that camp, forever. As the weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to take root inside the camp, something that no one, least of all Fron could have predicted. The boundaries between prisoner and guard, between enemy and neighbor, started to blur. What emerged was a sense of community, a fragile but undeniable humanity that defied every expectation Fron had carried across the Atlantic. It started with small things. The Canadians set up a recreation hall, filling it with books, board games, and even a battered old piano. For men who had spent years surrounded by the noise and chaos of war, the quiet clatter of chess pieces and the gentle notes of music felt almost sacred. Some prisoners, musicians before the war, dusted off their skills and gave impromptu concerts. Others formed a theater troupe, rehearsing German plays and inviting both prisoners and guards to watch. The guards didn't just tolerate these performances. They applauded, laughed, and sometimes even joined in. For a few hours, the war outside seemed to vanish, replaced by the universal language of laughter and song. Sports became another lifeline. Soccer matches were organized every Saturday, with teams from different barracks competing for bragging rights. The guards helped mark out a proper field, and someone even found real soccer balls. On game days, the camp buzzed with excitement. Prisoners cheered from the sidelines, and for a moment, everyone forgot about uniforms and allegiances. It felt like being back in school, like being part of something bigger than the war, bigger than the past. But it wasn't just about entertainment. The Canadians took their responsibilities seriously, especially when it came to health. When a prisoner named Joseph developed a severe toothache, he was taken to the camp hospital. There, a Canadian dentist treated him with care and skill, using equipment newer than anything Joseph had seen in Berlin. Another man broke his arm during a soccer match. A Canadian doctor set the bone, checked on him regularly, and made sure he healed properly. The hospital had X-ray machines, clean operating rooms, and a staff that treated every patient with dignity. For Fron, it was a revelation. He had expected pain and neglect, but instead found compassion and professionalism. The sense of normalcy was both comforting and confusing. Fron found himself laughing at comedies performed in his native language, playing soccer on sunlit afternoons, and eating meals that would have been unthinkable back home. He wrote letters to his family, trying to explain the surreal reality of his life in Canada, but words always fell short. How could he describe the feeling of being treated as a person, not a prisoner? How could he explain that, in the heart of enemy territory, he had found a kind of peace? Yet beneath the surface, guilt gnawed at him. Each letter from home was a reminder of the suffering in Germany, of bombed cities, empty pantries, and families torn apart by war. Fran's mother wrote about ration cards that never stretched far enough, about neighbors who had disappeared, about the cold that seeped into their bones each winter. Meanwhile, Fron was gaining weight, his cheeks filling out, his skin glowing with health. He felt guilty, almost ashamed, as if he were stealing comfort from those who needed it most. Still, the kindness of the Canadians was impossible to ignore. They didn't just follow the rules. They went out of their way to show respect, to offer dignity, to treat their prisoners as men, not monsters. The guards encouraged the prisoners to organize their own activities, to form soccer teams, to put on plays, to build a life within the boundaries of their captivity. There were no forced marches, no arbitrary punishments, no attempts to break their spirits. Instead, there was a quiet expectation that the men would respect the rules, because they were being respected in return. For Fron, this was the most disorienting part of all. He had been prepared for cruelty, for hardship, for a daily struggle to survive. He had not been prepared for kindness. He had not been prepared to feel safe. The absence of fear was almost more frightening than fear itself. It forced him to question everything he thought he knew about the world, about his enemies, about himself. But the most powerful lesson was yet to come. The true test of trust, the moment that would shatter the last of Fron's old beliefs, was waiting just around the corner. And when it arrived, it would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in that camp, forever. December in Alberta was a world of white silence. Snow blanketed the camp, muffling every sound, turning the prairie into a frozen sea. For Fron, Christmas had always been a time of family, warmth, and tradition. But now, as a prisoner in a foreign land, the holiday felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life, another version of himself. He woke up on Christmas Eve expecting nothing more than another cold day, another reminder of everything he'd lost. But that morning, something was different. The Canadian Guard seemed lighter, almost cheerful, as they decorated the dining hall with paper chains in red and green. A small pine tree appeared in the corner, its branches strung with candles and bits of ribbon. The air buzzed with anticipation, and even the most hardened prisoners couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. What could the enemy possibly have planned for them on a day like this? At lunch, the camp commander made an announcement. That night, there would be a special Christmas dinner and everyone was invited. Fron tried not to hope, tried not to remember the Christmases of his childhood, but as the sun set and the prisoners filed into the dining hall, he felt his heart beating faster. The room was transformed. White tablecloths covered the tables, real plates and glasses gleamed in the candlelight, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. For a moment, it didn't feel like a prison at all. Then the food arrived. Platters of turkey and ham, bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting on top, carrots and green beans, hot rolls straight from the oven, and even cranberry sauce. Franz stared at his plate, unable to believe what he was seeing. This was more food than he'd seen in years, more than most families in Germany would see all winter. Around him, the other prisoners sat in stunned silence, some with tears in their eyes as they realized this was real. This was a feast, not just for the body but for the soul. But the surprises weren't over. After dinner, the doors opened and a group of Canadian townspeople entered, their arms full of gifts. They moved from table to table, handing out small packages, bars of chocolate, packs of cigarettes, pairs of warm socks, even books. When a gray-haired woman stopped in front of Fron and handed him a neatly wrapped package, he felt his hands tremble. Inside was a dark blue wool scarf, handmade, the stitches tight and even. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, her eyes kind and full of understanding. Fron could barely speak. He had never received a gift from a stranger, let alone from someone he'd been taught to hate. As the evening wore on, someone began to sing Silent Night in German. One by one, voices joined in, filling the hall with the haunting melody of home. Then, almost as if on cue, the Canadian guards and townspeople began to sing the same song in English. Two languages, two histories, two sides of a brutal war, united for a moment by hope, by music, by the simple wish for peace. Fron looked around the room, at the faces of men who had once been enemies, now sharing a meal, a song, and a sense of humanity that no barbed wire could ever contain. That night, as he lay in his warm bed, the blue scarf clutched in his hands, Fron felt something inside him break and heal at the same time. The propaganda, the hatred, the fear, they all seemed so small compared to the kindness he had witnessed. He realized that true strength wasn't about power or victory, but about the courage to show compassion, even to those you've been told to despise. For Fron, that Christmas was more than a holiday. It was a turning point, a moment when the walls of his old beliefs finally crumbled, replaced by a new understanding of what it meant to be human. And as the snow fell quietly outside, he knew he would never forget the night when enemies became friends. And a simple act of kindness changed everything. When the war finally ended, Franz stood on the deck of a ship bound for Europe, the Canadian coastline shrinking behind him. The Atlantic, which once seemed like a barrier between worlds, now felt like a bridge he was crossing as a changed man. In his bag, he carried only a few treasures: English textbooks, photographs of the camp, and the blue scarf that had come to mean more than any medal or uniform. But what weighed most heavily was the uncertainty of what waited for him on the other side. As the ship docked in Hamburg, the reality of post-war Germany hit Fron like a punch to the gut. The city was a graveyard, buildings reduced to skeletons, streets choked with rubble, and people moving like shadows through the ruins. The air was thick with smoke and desperation. Children with hollow cheeks begged for scraps, old women pushed carts filled with broken memories, and everywhere the silence of loss hung heavier than any winter snow. Fron's journey home was a gauntlet of heartbreak. It took 3 days of walking and hitching rides on battered army trucks to reach his mother's house. When she opened the door, she barely recognized him. Her hair had turned white, her face was lined with worry and hunger, and her hands shook as she pulled him inside. The house was cold, half the windows boarded up, most of the furniture gone, burned for heat during the endless winters. She made tea from dried leaves and roots, and offered him a piece of bread so small and hard it barely counted as food. "This is half my ration for today," she whispered, pushing it toward him. Fron couldn't bring himself to eat it. They split it, neither piece enough to quiet the ache in their stomachs. The contrast between his life in Canada and the devastation of Germany was almost too much to bear. In the camp, he had eaten until he was full, slept in a warm bed, and felt the dignity of being treated as a human being. Here he was free but trapped by hunger, cold, and the weight of a country that had lost everything. His mother kept repeating, "You're so healthy," as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Fron realized he probably weighed 40 pounds more than her. The guilt was suffocating. News from the rest of his family was even worse. His brother had died on the Russian front. His sister's husband was missing, likely dead in a camp somewhere. Friends and neighbors eyed him with suspicion and resentment. "You got fat while we starved," one neighbor spat. "You were safe while we got bombed." Fron understood their anger. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. At night, lying on a thin mattress in his childhood room, Fron thought about the camp in Canada. He remembered the warmth of the stove, the laughter during soccer games, the taste of real bread and butter, the kindness of strangers who had every reason to hate him. Here, in the ruins of his homeland, freedom felt like another kind of prison, a place where hope was rationed and the future seemed as bleak as the bombed-out skyline. He tried to explain his experience to those around him, but most refused to believe it. How could the enemy have shown such mercy? How could a prisoner of war have lived better than the citizens of the so-called master race? Some accused him of lying, others of betrayal. The truth was too painful, too foreign to accept. As the months passed, Fron did what he could to help rebuild. He used the farming skills he'd learned in Canada to work the land, trading potatoes and eggs for a little comfort. But every day, he was haunted by memories of a place where enemies became friends, where kindness was stronger than hate, and where the real victory was measured not in battles won, but in hearts changed. And as he watched his mother eat the last crumbs of bread, Fron knew that the greatest loss of all was not the war itself, but the lies that had kept his people from seeing the truth, a truth he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, the scars of war lingered everywhere Fron looked. Germany was a country trying to piece itself back together, but the wounds ran deeper than shattered buildings or empty pantries. For Fron, the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the silence that settled over every conversation, the unspoken questions about what had really happened, and the quiet shame that clung to those who had survived. Rumors began to swirl through the battered towns and villages. Some said that former prisoners of war were being allowed to return to Canada, that the country which had once held them captive was now offering them a new beginning. Reports claimed that over 6,000 Germans made the journey back across the Atlantic, drawn by the promise of land, jobs, and a future that seemed impossible in the ruins of Europe. Fron heard stories of men who married Canadian women, who became farmers and businessmen, who built new lives in a land that had once been the enemy. Every day, Fron wrestled with the temptation to leave. He still had his English textbooks, his photographs from the camp, and the blue scarf that had become a symbol of everything he'd learned. He imagined what it would be like to start over in a place where kindness was a way of life, where the past didn't hang over every meal, every conversation, every dream. But each time he thought about leaving, he saw his mother's tired eyes, his sister's quiet resilience, the neighbors who depended on him to help rebuild what little they had left. Duty and family kept him rooted in the soil of a country that no longer felt like home. Yet even as he stayed, Fron never forgot what he had seen. On the hardest days, when the hunger gnawed at his insides and the cold seeped through the walls, he would take out his treasures from Canada, the photos, the books, the scarf, and remember. He remembered the guard who told him, "You can go for a walk if you want." He remembered the Christmas dinner that changed everything, the laughter during soccer games, the feeling of being treated as a person, not an enemy. He remembered that there was a place in the world where abundance was real, where kindness wasn't a weakness, and where even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. As the years passed, Fron became a quiet legend in his town. He taught his grandchildren English, told them stories about the camp with no fences, and tried to pass on the lessons he had learned. He spoke of a country that had defeated its enemies not with bombs or bullets, but with generosity and trust. He told them that the strongest prison isn't made of wire and walls, but of lies you believe about yourself and others, and that the only way to escape is for someone to be kind enough to show you the truth. For Fron, the legacy of his time in Canada was more than just survival. It was a new way of seeing the world, a belief that true strength is measured not by how hard you can strike, but by how deeply you can care. He never returned to Canada, but in his heart, he carried a piece of it with him always, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can be found in the most unexpected places. And as he watched his grandchildren grow up in a world slowly healing from the wounds of war, Fron knew that the real victory wasn't written in history books or carved into monuments. It lived in the quiet moments of compassion, in the courage to forgive, and in the simple, stubborn belief that kindness could change everything. In the end, Fron's story wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. It was about a man who crossed an ocean as an enemy and returned home forever changed by the unexpected power of kindness. For years, he had believed that strength was measured in victories, in discipline, in the ability to endure suffering. But Canada had shown him something different, something that would echo through the rest of his life and the lives of those who heard his story. He often told his grandchildren, "Canada won the war before they ever fought us." It was a statement that puzzled them at first, but as he explained, the meaning became clear. The real victory wasn't in the battles or the treaties, but in the way a nation treated its prisoners, with dignity, with respect, and with a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout. Canada's greatest weapon wasn't its army or its technology. It was its ability to show mercy, to offer hope, and to prove that true strength comes from compassion, not cruelty. Fron would sit by the window on cold winter nights, the blue scarf wrapped around his neck, and remember the Christmas dinner that changed everything. He remembered the faces of the Canadian guards, the laughter of the townspeople, the taste of turkey and fresh bread, the sound of Silent Night sung in two languages. He remembered the moment when he realized that the strongest prison is built not from steel and stone, but from the lies we tell ourselves about who we are and who our enemies must be. He never forgot the lesson that Canada had taught him, that the walls we build in our minds are often harder to escape than any physical barrier. And sometimes, all it takes to break those walls is a single act of kindness, a meal shared, a gift given, a song sung together in the darkness. In a world that so often chooses fear over trust, suspicion over understanding, Fron's story stands as a reminder that the most powerful change begins with the courage to see your enemy as human. As the years passed, Fron watched the world change. He saw old enemies become allies, saw nations rebuild from the ashes, saw his own family grow up in a world that, while still imperfect, was shaped by the hope that things could be different. He knew that the scars of war would never fully fade, but he also knew that healing was possible, one act of compassion at a time. So what does it mean to win a war? For Fron, the answer was simple. It means winning hearts, not just battles. It means proving your strength not by how much you can destroy, but by how much you can give. It means leaving behind a legacy of hope, so that even in the darkest times, the light of kindness can guide the way forward. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of victory the world needs most.